there's so much. I'm in dismay as to how to cover Jimmy Carter. So I'll just say at the beginning, we'll just try to get a few bits of information and understanding and insight particularly with his theological, moral, ethical development. But of course, we have to cover, to some degree, the political history there. To my mind, I must tell you, Jimmy Carter is one of he's at near the top of the list of my saints, the people who I look to for inspiration and guidance. And it's just a treasured icon for many of us uh, in this country and in this church. He's right up there in my book with people like Albert Schweitzer, people like Dietrich Bonhoeffer, and Desmond Tutu. He belongs in that lineup and is a source of uh, inspiration and courage. Has been, continues to be. I always start with mentioning a few books, uh, partly so you'll understand that I have given some study and thought to the subject, but also the books are so wonderful, and I'm just going to mention three. Carter himself wrote many, many books, some of them quite small, and many of them quite readable. Uh, the book I named first for this book, for this group, is a book by a theologian, writer, Randall Randall Balmer, Balmer, Randall Balmer, and the title is Redeemer, The Life of Jimmy Carter. It's not a brand new book. I've forgotten the date of publication. Well, 2014. And if for people who have a particular interest in his religious church connections and so on, that's the book to read. The second book I mentioned is a very recent one, published just a couple of years ago, one called His Very Best by a man named Jonathan Alter, who writes books on politics and history and that sort of thing. It is just, I just read it fairly recently, and it is just the best thing available in terms of a general biography of Carter. And one more book I'll throw in. Jimmy Carter, as I already said, wrote many himself. Some years ago, he wrote a book called Living Faith. Maybe some of you remember it. It's really taken from his Sunday school lessons, and it's his explicitly and directly theological uh, exposition, giving his thoughts, drawing upon his Sunday school lessons through the years. And it got a wide, it was out maybe 15 years ago and got a wide readership. And it's available in inexpensive paperback. Well, we have to start with a little bit about Carter's family. That's a huge subject. We can only touch on it. I think one way to begin to think about envisage his family, is to borrow a quotation from his brother, Billy Carter, whom we all know about. When Carter was running for the presidency back in 1976, reporters, of course, developed a great interest. Wait a minute, let me click this thing that says got it. All right, I can see Jessica better. Um, Reporters said to Billy Carter in an interview, said, now some people see you as a little bit strange. Billy was a kind of maverick type and uh, didn't seem to fit in some ways. Billy Carter replied in these words, you may have heard these before. Look, my mama was a 70-year-old Peace Corps volunteer in India. My sister goes, one of my sisters goes all over the world as a holy roller preacher. My oldest sister spends half her time on a Harley Davidson motorcycle, and my brother thinks he's going to be president of the United States. Which of our family do you think is normal? Well, it was not a normal family and a colorful and very interesting family. Carter was born in 1924, just 10 years before me, so it's easy for me to remember. He had these two sisters, Gloria and Ruth, and then his brother Billy, Billy came along 13 years later, so you got a big age gap between the oldest, Jimmy, and his brother. And his parents, of course, are key to understanding Jimmy Carter. Father Earl, what a character Earl was. Now, these people are in rural Georgia. Earl is a businessman, farmer, operator, entrepreneur. He does a lot of different things. He's not in the field hoeing cotton, or he's not walking behind the mules, but he's supervising people who do that, including son Jimmy. A very energetic man, uh, ambitious, hardworking, frugal. One writer says the traits that would propel his success. He also learned, that is, Jimmy learned from his father, kindness and charity, and also acquired his habits of hyperbole, etc., etc. Jimmy Carter worshipped his father. He just, well, his father was his ideal. His father was very athletic and also sort of competitive with Jimmy. They had a tennis court. I can't imagine what a tennis court in this rural Georgia setting would look like, but they had one. And apparently Earl was a super tennis player. And Jimmy aspired to be as good and one day beat him, but he never did. His father was always prevailed. He was hungry, Jimmy was, as a youngster, for approval of his father. His father was reluctant to give it. In many ways, he loved Jimmy, but he wasn't very expressive in his affection. And we can only speculate somewhat about this, but we can see the youngster striving for approval and generally not getting it, at least in the measure in which he deserved. Um, we'll say more along the road as we go down the road a little further. We'll say a little bit more about his father, but his father was a, a dominant figure in his life, especially, of course, his early life. Lillian, the mother. You've heard a lot about Lillian, I'm sure, and we'll say more about her down the road. There's a story that Jimmy tells in one of his books. This is sort of midlife. Jimmy and his sister Ruth are going through some of the old furniture from the house they once lived in. And they come across this old weather-beaten, dark-colored desk amongst the old furniture. And Jimmy says to the desk, "Hello, Mother." And Ruth breaks out into laughter, recognizing that very often during their childhood, when Ruth and Jimmy would come home from school, Mother would not be there to welcome them, but there would be a note on the desk explaining where she was, telling them what they ought to do, and so on. So Lillian wasn't there. And even when she wasn't there, she wasn't heavy into motherhood. In some ways, Earl did a little more than his share of mothering and care for the children. And one reason she wasn't there, the main reason, not the only reason, she was a nurse. And in those days, they had what one writer calls itinerant nurse. She didn't set up in an office or in a hospital or somewhere and people come see her. No, she traveled. She went to the homes. And importantly, she provided her nursing talents and abilities to African American families as well as to white families. And as a result, had a rather close contact and frequent contact with the African American population of that area where they lived. Now, Jimmy Carter was born in Plains. You all know that. Everybody knows that. Many people don't know his family didn't live in Plains. They lived several miles from Plains in a little crossroads called Archery. You ever hear of Archery, Georgia? It's there. There's some plaques there showing that Jimmy Carter grew up there. Uh, Archery was a small, not really a organized city, but a kind of crossroads, mainly African American. There's only one other white family in the neighborhood. So most of the people surrounding Jimmy Carter in his youth and surrounding the rest of his family were African Americans, many of them workers for his father, living in shacks, dwellings, houses that his father provided. His father worked a lot of land, corn, wheat, and of course, peanuts in time. So uh, Jimmy Carter had this early immersion. Most of his friends, almost all of his friends, were African Americans. When he went to school first time, he talked a little funny because he got his accent in his speech from the African American folks around. So he had something of a they call Negro accent from that environment, and his best friends, as I've already said. As he grew up, and this is a very rural. You won't elaborate on this much, but it was. Lillian used to say we weren't poor, but we were country. It was very much a country existence given to farmers and farming. And Jimmy grew up around animals. He grew up milking cows. He grew up helping slaughter pigs. He grew up learning to plow behind a mule. All that sort of thing in this rural community of archery. Uh, Racially mixed world. They had a woman who lived full time in their house, helping with the cooking, doing the cooking. Uh, Carter, one of Carter's, probably his best book, certainly one of his best, is what's it called? An Hour Before Midnight, which is about his rural childhood. And the biographers all get material from there. Here's a quote from that book. My childhood world was really shaped by Black women. I played with their children, often ate and slept in their homes, later hunted, fished, plowed, and hoed with their husbands and children. And there was a Black couple named Jack and Rachel Clark. Jack was sort of primary foreman working directly under Earl, supervising workers on this large farm. And Rachel was often left to take care of Jimmy when Jimmy's parents were otherwise engaged. Uh, and Jimmy gives her a lot of credit for his moral and spiritual development. Uh, Jack and Rachel Clark lived on the farm. Jimmy slept in their house many nights. Relationship was so close that Rachel claimed Jimmy as one of our boys. Rachel often took young Jimmy on walks, pointing out the flora and the fauna along the way, and making the point, as Carter remembered, that God expected us to take care of his creation. Carter becomes in adulthood a champion of the environment and a champion of non-polluting energy and all of that sort of thing. Really the first president that ever took really firm lead on issues relating to the environment and global warming and et cetera. Ecologist advocates, which include all of us here perhaps, can look back to him as one of the first in this field. Well, he attributes this in part, at least, to Rachel Clark, an illiterate Black woman who spent a lot of time with him. He credited this woman with his own moral formation. He says, much more than my parents. She talked to me about religious and moral values that shaped a person's life. And I listened to her with acute attention. Without seeming to preach, she taught me how I should behave. Quite a tribute to an illiterate Black woman who lived and worked there on the farm. And she lived pretty well into his adult life. She lived to see him president. There's no indication that he had an ongoing close relationship with her, but certainly he He writes with considerable feeling about his early experience there, and you can suspect that had something to do with his evolving attitudes toward racial matters. One more person in this setting in archery, a bishop of the African American Church, Bishop William Decker Johnson. Now, a bishop of the African American Episcopal Church is a pretty powerful position, and it was and is a fairly large African American church, and the bishop has a lot of power. He had jurisdiction over a number of states. He lived nationwide, actually, and he wasn't always. In fact, he usually was not at home in archery, but when he would come home, it would be a big event. And they would typically have a major service in St. Mark's Methodist Episcopal Church, which was right there in the neighborhood. And Jimmy's family would be invited to attend the services on that occasion. Now, Earl wouldn't go, but Lillian would go. And also, we could say at this point that Lillian often attended memorial services in African American churches and sometimes spoke at them in the course of a memorial service. So again, she was a part of that community. Anyway, Jimmy remembers attending one of these services where the bishop was the preacher, and he wrote about it. As a little boy, he said, I was accustomed to the relatively sedate and constrained services of our own congregation at Plains Baptist Church. So our family visits to St. Mark's were strange experiences. The small white clapboard building was always overflowing with worshipers and would rock with music and with religious spirit, far exceeding anything we ever experienced. We knew the words to many of the hymns, but we had to struggle to try to keep the proper time. So he got baptized fairly early into African American worship, which really served him well later on when he was a campaigner and would be invited to speak or preach at an African American church. He knew the hymns, he could sing them with the congregation, and he was quite at home there. And he writes at some modest length about the power of the bishop's sermons and so on. There's a story that illustrates something about the social setting, about the bishop visiting the Carters on one of his infrequent visits back to archery. He would come by to talk to Brother Earl. Now, normally in that setting, an African American visiting a white home would go to the back door. Now, the bishop was not about to go to the back door. On the other hand, he wasn't going to flagrantly challenge the local mores. So, as Jimmy describes it, the bishop would come by in a chauffeur-driven Cadillac and stop out in the front yard under the pecan tree and honk. And Earl would come out, and they would stand together under the pecan tree and have a chat about the local news and so on and so on. They had a friendly, somewhat jocular relationship, a relationship of mutual respect. Now, the bishop had a son named Alvis. I think that's what his name was. Yeah, Alvin, who was a student in one of the New England at Harvard or one of those New England Eastern universities, a high class college. And Lillian would keep up with Alvin. How is Alvin doing? And when Alvin would come for a visit, Lillian would invite him into the front door, and he'd come in the front door, and they would sit down in the living room and have a chat. And Earl would just sort of make it a point of not being home or having to go somewhere when that would happen. So he wouldn't criticize or challenge Lillian's deviant social habits, such as that one. But that gives you a little snapshot of the social situation that they live in. And Jimmy talks a good bit about the influence of the bishop. There is in the community now of Archery a plaque of some kind celebrating the bishop, and there's a grave there. And Jimmy says, now he's writing this in his midlife. I go by his relatively modest grave on occasion and wonder how much my own ambitions were kindled by these impressions. Ambitions because the bishop was from lowly rural background. He scrambled hard to get an education, and he really made it to the top of his profession. I don't know how much there is to that, but Jimmy at least speculates about it, that maybe that planted some of the seeds of my own ambition and my own notion that maybe I could be a prominent person someday. The other person to mention, or one other person to mention, is Julia Coleman. Julia Coleman was a remarkable teacher, school teacher, and principal of the school. She wasn't even 5 feet tall. She walked with a limp. She had reading eyesight problems, so she could read only with very thick glasses. But she was both determined and charismatic, and herself was quite well educated and enlightened, and was a real inspiration to Jimmy Carter, a real force, uh, and as the school generally was. An interesting description of the school: they would open the day with a chapel service. It's a public school, Charles, in rural Georgia. They would say the Pledge of Allegiance to the flag, and they'd sing Onward, Christian Soldiers, and they'd sing He Leadeth Me, and they would memorize Bible verses, just like they did in church. Now, Jimmy and Earl were both avid believers in separation of church and state. They were Baptists to the core on that, but somehow this practice did not seem to bother them. And anyway, Julia Coleman was behind that and presided over all that. Carter loved to read from the beginning. He loved to learn. Uh, he remembered that at age 13, Julia Coleman persuaded him to read Tolstoy's War and Peace. I haven't gotten to that myself, but he was reading at age 13 with her inspiration and encouragement. And there was a lot of memorizing and reciting from the Bible. The 23rd Psalm, the 13th chapter of 1 Corinthians, passages familiar to most of us. And she challenged her students generally, but especially challenged him. In the long run, she ends up being quoted in his inaugural address. Some writer said the only inaugural address that quotes a school teacher. It's Julia Coleman, Jimmy Carter quoting Julia Coleman, who had a saying something like, we need to learn to change in the light of changing circumstances, but hold firm to basic principles. It becomes close to a philosophy that he adopts, that he picked up from her. And of course, church is a big part of their life. You know that from the beginning. I think Lillian was less enthusiastic or determined about it than Earl. He was a Sunday school teacher, Earl was, and he presided over teaching the children to quote the Bible and Bible stories and whatnot. Also, there was a household practice that Earl established. The children of the family, there are, 5 of them now? No, 4. Anyway, they were each given a penny to put in the collection at Sunday school that would go to overseas missionary programs. And one day, I guess they'd pass a plate around or something, and the kids would put their pennies in. One day, Jimmy took a penny out, and stupidly, when he got home, he put 2 pennies out on the dresser in the bedroom. And his daddy found the 2 pennies and knew where they came from. And he got a pretty serious whipping on that occasion. And Jimmy said, I've never stolen another thing in my entire life. So he learned a lesson there from Father Earl. Earl was a deacon, Earl was a Sunday school teacher, and so on. Another piece of his youth has to do with his conversion. They had, as rural churches did, and I've been in some of this with a Methodist flavor before, summer revivals. Guest preacher comes in, 2 services a day, and the young people, of course, along with others, are encouraged to convert, to have a conversion experience. Generally, Jimmy points out that age 8 was supposed to be the sort of norm, and it happened with proper instruction and guidance that a good portion of the children would in fact get converted during a revival meeting. Earl thought that was a little young, so Jimmy didn't have his experience until he was 11 years old. This becomes a matter of great discussion, of course, in later years when Jimmy identifies himself, as others identify him as having been born again. In his book he wrote as an adult now, this is not when he's 11 years old, but he writes an account of this experience and what it meant and what it means to him. What does it mean when I say I decided to accept Christ? Jesus was the Messiah, the long-awaited Savior, who came both to reveal God to us and to heal division between God and humankind, etc. Born again, it's when an intimate melding of my life with that of Jesus. This is the adult speaking now. I become a brother with him, and God is our mutual parent. He was quite earnest about faith and religion from an early time. Being born again, he said, is a new life, not of perfection, but of striving, stretching, searching, a life of intimacy with God through the Holy Spirit. There must be an emptying, then a refilling. To the extent that we want to know, understand, and experience God, we can find all of this in Jesus. Another sentence that stands out, the love of Christ helps us feel the fullness of God. And then a little further on in this is really a Sunday school lesson that he printed up. Being born again didn't happen to me when I was 11. For me, it has been an evolutionary thing rather than a flash of light or a sudden vision of God speaking. It involved a series of steps that have brought me steadily closer to Christ. My conversion at 11 was just one of those steps. So we have here what some people would call a sort of liberalization of the understanding of conversion, not just something that happens all at once and all together, but an evolutionary thing, a little bit more in line with a sort of mainline Protestant understanding of conversion. Taking a big jump ahead, as Jimmy does well in high school, of course. He plays a little basketball, plays some sports, and he's not at the top of his class, but he does well. And then he goes to the Naval Academy. I don't want to say very much about that, but he's 19 years old. This is a big step. It was essentially leaving home for a good portion of the time. He reports from that experience that while at the Naval Academy, during his 3 years there, I attended chapel regularly, and I got to know the chaplain pretty well. And I also taught Sunday school. So he hangs on to these childhood practices and habits that he learned at the beginning. He also says they did a lot of questioning, and he did, and some of his colleagues, about religious matters. He seems at an early time to have doubts, questions about some of the standard doctrines, and he talks about staying up late at night while he was in college, talking about the nature of God, or the existence of God, or the omnipotence or limitations of God. He said, and these talks are all very profound. A little irony in his reporting of that. Well, one has to say a word now about the racial situation that hung over his life there in his early days, in his growing up days. I've already said that most of his playmates in the earliest days were African American boys. They hunted together, fished together, so on. Uh, Carter reports that when he was about an event that happened when he was about 14 years old, he was with a group of friends, and they were approaching a gate that would lead from one field into another field. And his friends had to step back, allowing him to go first, or indicating that he should go first. And it was kind of an awakening to him. He hadn't thought much about racial differences. It was just part of his growing up. But suddenly he was being treated with deference, having been taught to do that, no doubt, by the social situation and by their parents. Uh, his mother, Lillian, had a significant, not necessarily decisive, but significant impact on him. She worked in black households, I've already said, and she was suspected of being a little slack in her support and fondness for segregation. She apparently was called nigger lover occasionally by some of the friends and neighbors. Uh, he remembers his mother watching the McCarthy hearings in 1954 and being repelled by them. And this part is amazing to me. In 1964, when Lyndon B. Johnson was running for president and was terribly unpopular in this part of Georgia, his mother opened and ran the Johnson campaign office there in Plains. And her car was sometimes attacked, windows broken, rocks thrown, and so on. And again, graffiti, he says. Her automobile was covered with graffiti nearly every day. The radio antenna broken off, or tied in a knot. And of course, the accusation of being nigger lover. She was not, by today's standards, an overt crusader for desegregation or racial justice, but she leaned enough in that direction that it was noticed that she had a different idea, and she suffered some for it. But she's a pretty tough lady, and she survived it all. Carter also attributes his eventual feminism to his mother. She was something of a feminist, not certainly as today. She didn't openly advocate or talk about or push male-female equality, but she acted as though she felt herself equal, and so on. Part of this comes out in another Sunday school lesson that we have a copy of that he published, where Jimmy looks at the gender issue in the New Testament, and particularly in the teachings of Jesus. First century Palestine consigned women to a completely subservient position, he wrote. But the advent of Jesus heralded a new era. Jesus Christ promoted women to a status of equality, and so on and so on. he noted that it was women who initially spread the news of the resurrection. Now, that's discussed a lot these days and widely recognized, but not made much note of before, and certainly not in Carter's early days. Jesus showed care for the despised woman as he sat at the well with the woman Samaritan, and later with the woman who was caught in adultery, and so on and so on. Women played a central role in the early church. And his book on living faith contains several Sunday school lessons along these lines of promoting a biblically based understanding of male-female equality. And he attributes this, in part at least, to his mother's feelings about those issues and matters. Well, okay, he's off to the Naval Academy at age 19. I mentioned that. I'm going to skip most of that beyond what I've already said. And from there, as you all know, he has a career in the Navy. 9 years he's in the Navy. He does relatively well, by the way, at the academy. I've forgotten what his standing in the class was, but it was relatively high. And he launches off into this career. He's become a naval officer. I skip over the part of why did he want to become a naval officer and all that. It had to do with a relative that he respected and so on. He spends some time in Norfolk, in Pearl Harbor, Hawaii. Oh, yeah, and I need to throw this in. He also gets married during this period. He's off to the academy. Rosalind Smith, who had been a neighbor, an acquaintance, a friend of his sister's, and so on, he knew, but they hadn't, I don't think they dated in high school. Oh, yes, I guess they were still in high school when they had their first date. He was skimming over this very rapidly. We don't know that much about it, but pretty quickly attracted to one another and fond of one another. Then Jimmy goes off and he comes back for a holiday in 1945, summer holiday. Anyway, they decide to get married. Rosalind is not quite out of high school yet, and they have to wait for that. She's 19 years old and he's 22, so they're roughly the same age. And in 1946, they get married, and she's with him then in this naval career and we're going to hear more about Rosalind later on. They travel, they rather flourish. There were some hard times in the Navy. Rosalind is delighted to get out of planes. She just didn't like the small town tightness, and she was also afraid that Jimmy's mother was a little domineering toward her, and her mother was a little domineering. Her father died, and she didn't want to be trapped with those two women and live in the same town with them. So she liked living different places: Norfolk, Pearl Harbor, San Diego, Connecticut, and so on. So they had, and they began to have children during this period, of course. And in his Navy career, as we all know, and I won't dwell on, he becomes involved with Hyman Rickover, the man who's developing nuclear submarines, and Jimmy gets into that program, which is a rather elite place to be. So he's doing very well as a naval officer. He's being promoted, demonstrating talents, learning a lot. One little incident, which turns out not to be all that little, but in terms of the racial issue, his crew to the ship he is with were in Jamaica at one point. Jamaica was a British colony. British officials invited the crew to a shore party, all except for a black sailor. There was a black person in the crew. I should say part of Carter's interracial experience occurs during his naval time. There were some African Americans involved on ship and in the crew, and there was one at least at this time. But the British governor there in Jamaica doesn't want the black sailor to come to the party, and so Jimmy and his colleagues, his fellow officers, I don't know whether Jimmy was the leader, he doesn't say that, but anyway, they decide they're not going to accept the invitation because of the exclusion of the African American guy. And Jimmy reports that episode in all of his. He has several biographical books. He always reports that, and that becomes especially relevant in 1950. Oh my God, no, I got till 10:30, right? All right, okay. 1950, he goes home for a Christmas holiday. He hadn't been home in 7 years. Been gone a long time. Been living in a different world. He's been living all over the world, different places in the United States. He's been exposed to all cosmopolitan influences, way different from Plains, Georgia, and had not been in touch with his family. I don't know how much they telephoned or wrote, but anyway, he hadn't. But he goes home in 1950, December, and he tells his father about this episode in Jamaica. And he tells it he's a little proud of himself. He's proud of what they did. They stood up to this lieutenant governor of Jamaica and would not go to his segregated party. And his father explodes. His father is living. Now, some of the biographers kind of puzzle about that. Apparently, it was known that Jimmy and his father had differences on this subject. It was a touchy subject. They just mostly avoided. They didn't talk about it. Of course, he hadn't been home to talk about it. So why would Jamie bring it up? Because it was sure to start a fight or a conflict at least. One writer speculates maybe Jimmy needed. He worshipped his father. He wanted to be like his father, but he wanted some independence too. He didn't just want to be a clone. And maybe this was a tool to assert his independence. We don't know, speculation. But anyway, they had a very serious exchange and a bitter conflict. And the visit, well, this writer says, the last and most bitter argument between father and son thus erupted on the issue of race. I guess a lot of people could point to conflicts with parents as a significant move in one direction or another. Okay. The next thing to jump to is not unrelated to what we just reported. Several years later, just about 3 years later, it's learned that Earl Carter was diagnosed with cancer. He smoked 2 packs a day. Most of the other Carter siblings, other than Jimmy, also smoked a lot and also were taken eventually with cancer. His family was just knocked down one by one, including his sisters and his brother. Anyway, Earl, at age 50 something, 53, 54, not very old, has cancer. And this is a severe blow to Jimmy, in spite of the difference, in spite of the tension, in spite of the disagreement. He still, part of him at least, worshiped his father, admired him greatly. So Jimmy goes home in his father's dying days. He had some accumulated leave so he could get off for a couple of weeks, and he went home and spent a good week or two, a good space of time talking to his father and witnessing how the people, the train of people, black and white, who would come in to visit the father, pay their respects, and express their gratitude for some good deed that the father had done for them. When their child was graduated from high school and didn't have the proper clothes, Earl would know about that and see to it that the young man had a suit to wear for the graduation ceremony. Or when a woman living on the margins lost her husband, he would help out. Or somebody needed a loan so they could get their seed and their fertilizer to get the crop going. Jimmy just had no idea that Earl had mainly secretly, privately done so much for so many people, and that he was so loved and admired by so many people. And this just made a huge impact upon him. And to the amazement of almost virtually everyone who knew him or knew anything about him, he decided to leave his flourishing career as a nuclear submarine naval officer and go home to Plains and become a peanut farmer, warehouse operator, fill his father's shoes, take his father's place there in Plains. There were some problems because he'd been away for a long time and Billy had grown up and Billy expected Billy would step in the father's footsteps when the time came. So they had a conflict over that, but they worked that out. The problem, one of the serious problems, maybe the most serious, is Rosalind was absolutely opposed. He didn't discuss with her whether or not to leave the Navy and go back to Plains. He simply decided to do it and informed her as to what they were going to do. Now, this man eventually becomes a champion of gender equality, you understand, but he wasn't there yet. Anyway, they almost had a divorce. He wrote in one place that she was almost physically uh, hostile to this decision. They were living in Schenectady at the time, so they had a long drive home. And the story is they were totally silent. She would not speak to him. One of the sons was with them on this trip, and if she needed to stop to go to the bathroom or to get something to eat, she would tell Jack, "Tell your father I need so and so." They just almost came apart. Uh, they had some other problems later on, but that was the most serious one. And she complied. She complied, and in the long run becomes 100% collaborator with him in business and in politics. But this was huge, and this is the time for major shift. I was miserable, she said. Jimmy's plans were to take charge of the family's farm enterprise, harbored even then some thoughts about following in his father's footsteps. His father had mentioned, he'd become active in the community. He'd been on the county board of commissioners. He'd been on the school board. He belonged to various clubs and organizations. So he was a prominent man in community. He was also well-to-do financially by this time. He'd been successful in his various agricultural and uh, business projects. Uh, I had only one life to live, Carter explained about his decision, and I wanted to live it as a civilian with a potentially fuller opportunity for varied public service. You don't know, did he really have running for the Senate in the back of his head or running for something, or we don't, we don't know. Uh, but so they're back in Plains. The first year or so in Plains, they lived in public housing. They didn't have much money at the time. Uh, so uh, they lived, and also in the first few years, or the first year at least, back in Plains, this writer says his agricultural skills were not auspicious. Owning in part to a drought, the Carter farm turned a profit of less than $300 in 1954. $300 is not too good for a several thousand acre farm. But with time, business savvy, better weather, and with Rosalind keeping the books, the fortunes of the farm began to improve. The Carters moved out of public housing, built a house in Plains, and by 1960, the Carter warehouse, which was his basic operation, had grown to be a major business operation, and they were okay uh, financially. Now remember what 1964 was. That's when the Supreme Court decision on school desegregation came down the pike, and that's the year Carter goes back to Plains, and that's the year when white supremacy, violence against desegregation, violence against racists grew. The Southerners were hopping mad, hostile to the powers that be, hostile to the government, hostile. They didn't like Kennedy. They didn't like LBJ and what LBJ was trying to do, and so on. So Carter comes back to a fire, in some senses, a very tense situation. He was okay. He had not been, people who knew him were close to him. They knew he had these uh, racial justice leanings, but they hadn't been prominent. He hadn't done anything publicly. In fact, he was pretty silent during the whole period of the civil rights movement. One of the writers that I've been reading, when I cited a while ago, really says that he stood on the side for the most part from the struggles of the 50s and then the major struggles of the later 60s. He did march with Martin Luther King. He didn't go to Martin Luther King's memorial service. He didn't speak out for the Voting Rights Act. He was mainly quiet, but he was quietly building a business, and also he wanted to be something of a leader in the community. He became a deacon in the church. He taught Sunday school like his father did. He got on the board of education and eventually became chair of the board of education there in Sumter County. But he didn't push for school desegregation. He did try to get he tried to get the school board aware of what conditions were like in the African American schools, which were deplorable. But he said he didn't know in the first year. He didn't even know that transportation was provided for white students and not provided for black students. Anyway, he got some of his colleagues on the school board to visit African American schools, and they found them deplorable. So much so they quit doing it. They'd sort of had enough. He tried to get more money for them so they could become equal, so they could meet the separate but equal standard. But also he promoted school consolidation, which is all over the country, I guess, at this time, bring the city schools and the county schools together. That was opposed on the suspicion, not with the certainty, with the suspicion that that would facilitate desegregation. And the opponents of consolidation, a major reason for being an opponent was to do nothing in the direction of desegregation. And in fact, the proposal was defeated. They did not consolidate at this time. And Carter was accused by some of being a nigger lover because he pushed for that. But that didn't go much of anywhere. It got a sign on, somebody put a sign on his barn during this period, Coons, Carter for Coons. So he experienced a little stress around the race issue. The one other episode that is pretty familiar, it occurs in all the books, is Carter's refusal to join the White Citizens Council. It was getting organized. It was really getting off the ground. It was booming. And one day at work, Carter's at work at the warehouse, a group of respectable citizens comes to visit him and invite him, almost insistingly, that he join the White Citizens Council. And he refuses. They don't give up. They come back several days later with several more important people from the community. They point out he is the only prominent white male in the area who has not joined the White Citizens Council. And this really irritates Carter. Also scares him because most of these guys are his customers. He lives in part by selling farm equipment, farm supplies, seeds, fertilizer, etc., to farmers. He really can't afford to be a pariah in the community, but nonetheless, it really angers him. Somebody says, I'll pay your initiation dues. It costs $5 to join. I'll pay your dues, and that really tees him off. He says, I'm going to get $5 from the drawer and I'm going to flush it down the toilet. It was kind of conspicuous. Anyway, that earned him some. He did stick his neck out there, didn't he? And it earned him some popularity. Uh, some people did boycott him, but apparently he outlived the boycott with Rosalind's help, I'm sure. She's very involved in the whole thing. The other incident during this period uh, in Plains is I think you've also heard generally about, and that had to do with his church. We're having sit-ins all over the country in different conversions, and also the civil rights people are sitting in churches. And the Plains Church, no one ever comes to the Plains Church, I don't think, at least not at this point. But the deacons uh, know that it might happen. So the deacons have a meeting and they adopt a policy of not seating African Americans who come to be seated. Well, Jimmy Carter's a deacon, but he's out of town. He's attending a funeral of someone several hundred miles away, so he misses the meeting of the deacons. But he comes back and insists that they have a church conference. We'd call it a church conference meeting or a congregational meeting where to discuss this policy with the whole congregation. And so Jim Carter and his family come back to town. Church has this meeting. There are about 200 people present. And Carter puts forward a proposal that anybody, including African Americans who come to worship and who have peaceful, honorable intent, be admitted. Well, out of the 200 or so present, that proposal got 6 positive votes. One from Rosalind, one from Jimmy, one from Lillian, one from one of their children, or maybe 2 from one of their children, and then one from a man who didn't know what he was doing, and they don't know why he voted for it. But anyway, now the good news is not everybody voted against it. A large portion of the people didn't vote, but they had to endure, as Rosalind reports, people at the church didn't speak to them for a while. At least there was a period during which a lot of people didn't speak to them. But and they lived through that. They lost some friends, they lost some business, but it wasn't fatal. Some people criticized, apparently some liberal folks from other parts of the country criticized Carter for not withdrawing from the church at that point. And he said, no. He said, I'm not going to leave the community. He says the human race is full of sin, and I'm not going to leave the human race. I'm going to stick with it. I'm going to be a part of it. I'm not just going to walk out. Later, he sort of does, but anyway, at that position, at that point, he wants to be a respected and is a respected member of the community.
Collins, we're about at the time.
Oh Lord have mercy. Okay, well maybe I'll just stop. Okay, I will.
Okay, all right.
All right.
So why don't we ask if there's anyone has a quick question or a comment they want to make. To do it, we could take about a minute, but we probably need to move on after that. Okay.
Okay.
If you want to unmute your mics and ask a question of Collins, that would be great. Okay.
I've skimmed over a lot. It's complicated. Anybody's life is complicated.
Yeah.
But here you have him.
Any of this?
Mm-hmm. All right, Fred, you and Mary want to ask a question, make a comment?
Question, but we're learning a lot because we weren't around during this era. So this is really, thank you for that.
I'll throw one concluding tidbit in. Down the road, there's something called Koinonia Farms.
Yes.
But you all know what the Koinonia Farms is?
Yeah.
Clarence Jordan,
yes.
Interracial farming community, established to be interracial. It's being boycotted. It's being vandalized. It's being attacked. It's being criticized. Jimmy Carter says not a word about it. He has no contact with Koinonia Farms to speak of.
When did he get connected with it?
Has no connection with it. He knows about it.
Oh, that's
The point really, the point is to illustrate how far Carter is at this point, though he's liberal from the standpoint of the typical citizen of pain, how far he is from the Carter we think about and celebrate when we speak of him and celebrate his social activism and his social justice witness. He's he's sort of in the closet on this issue, not altogether in the closet, but and he's well alone. He's in his midlife at this point. Okay.
I think
Next time
Earl
we
has
get
a
it.
question.
Earl has a question.
Thank you. Any chance you can do another session sometime and we can hear more about his presidency, or if you have a time to do it, that'd be great.
Next week.
I'm not sure what you're asking.
The focus on Jimmy Carter will go on for another 2 weeks. So
Yeah.
definitely headed down that path.
Yeah, we're still not going to get to the end, but yeah, we got 2 more weeks on Carter. He's going to become a senator. That's the next step. Then he becomes a governor. Then he becomes a defeated governor. And then he becomes a racist governor. No.
No.
Anyway, yeah, we got 2 more shots at this.
Okay.
okay.
Take care, everybody.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.